Hello, everyone. My name is Svetlana Stogny. I'm a quality architect, and today we are very excited to share lessons learned in building test strategy for the life science domain. So during this session, our speakers, our dear guests, I will introduce all of them later. We'll make an overview of life science projects. You will learn what is GxP, how to do risk assessment for such projects, and we'll cover the particularities of test automation in a GxP compliant project. And of course, we will wrap up this interesting discussion with the Q&A session. So please feel free to ask whatever you want in our channels, and we'll be happy to share everything with you. I will be moderator for this session, and here are our dear speakers, dear guests. We have Paulina Dyakova, who is a senior software testing manager. Paulina, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello, colleagues. Very nice to meet all of you here. My name is Paulina. I'm, as Sveta said, a senior software testing manager, has been working in IT for over 16 years, 10 of them as a test manager, and I've worked in many business domains, and last 6 years I've been concentrated on life science domain.
Thank you, Paulina. And we also have Ekaterina Postnova, who is a software testing team leader.
Hi everyone. So a few words about myself. So I work at HIPAA as software testing team leader, and overall I've been in quality engineering for over 16 years. And during this time, I have mostly focused on project in life science and healthcare domain. So I'm glad to be here today and to share some useful things with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, guys, let me provide some background on how the idea to present this talk appeared. As I mentioned before, I'm a quality architect with 20 plus years of experience. I created dozens of test strategies for different domains. However, during my latest engagement, I needed to propose a test strategy in life science domain under GxP regulations. And I was really surprised at how many things you need to consider. Of course, I was really lucky to meet Paulina at the workshop in Izmir, and she consulted me and helped me a lot. So let us reiterate this conversation for you, for those who are also in this stage and thinking about a strategy creation for such domain. Paulina, what particularities should be considered when building this strategy for life science?
Okay, so as an experienced quality architect, you probably know that every business domain has its own peculiarities, and they all have a lot of in common, but also have something specific to them. Like if we talk about the things that are in common, like for sure you should take into account the functionality. Functional testing should always be a part of testing strategy. You should also consider architecture, like how the system is built, and also consider if for your particular project some kind of non-functional requirements should be applied, like for example performance, security, etc. But if we talk about life science domain in particular, to the first place, here comes regulatory compliance. This is also a non-functional testing type, and I would say a non-functional requirements that should be applied and built throughout the whole software lifecycle. So a few words, maybe why it is so important. Like, as you know, life science works with mostly high-risk areas, and it deals with human lives and humans' health, and making mistakes in such projects can lead to a lot of people hurt or damaged, or maybe the consequences can be very, very serious. And we can even talk about few examples of when the procedures were not met and compliance requirements were not followed, which caused like pretty serious results. So, for example, one life science company in 2012 was doing some kind of steroid injections. And the problem was that the company was not following GxP procedures and compliance requirements for years. And it ended up in these steroid injections being contaminated. And as a result, 750 people were infected with fungal meningitis, and even 64 of them died. And this is definitely like not the result that anybody was anticipating.
So yes, looks like despite the fact that all these regulations are overcomplicated in this thing sometimes, but we definitely need to follow these rules. Otherwise, yeah, the consequences might be crucial. Could you please provide more specifics? What is this, all this compliance? What is it about, and what standards are there? How to understand which one should I apply on my project? How to choose? So all this mess, please help us to analyze and understand.
Yeah, sure. If we talk about like life science projects, you should ask yourself several questions, like what kind of area you're working in, and what kind of country you are working in, like where the patients of your application of your clients are located, because like different regulations apply to different countries. And if we speak about, for example, USA, then FDA has its own regulations which should be followed, and Europe has different, from like many perspectives, different regulations. You should definitely observe them. There are also a set of ISO standards that should be followed, and also, like you've already mentioned, such thing as GxP, which we will talk in details like in a minute. But this also is a process that should be followed. And also, you should ask yourself if you are dealing with patients' data or not, because this data is not just like personal data, it's also the data related to health. And this data is like very sensitive, and this data should be protected from leakage, because like not only it's very important to protect people's health data, also like I can give you one more example. Another company in 2016 was fined with $3 million fine for the fact that they might have the potential leakage of 60,000 patients' data, because they were not encrypting patients' data well enough, and they could be accessed from anywhere from the internet. So yeah. And also one more thing that you should take into account, that because the risks are so high, there are a lot of like potential damage that could be brought to the patients, and the fines that like countries and regulators apply are very high. the companies themselves try to protect themselves, and they create their own process that can be sometimes even stricter than regulators' requirements. And if this is the case, then you should definitely be following also their client's process in order to be compliant with them.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Paulina. And you know, on my project, I need to follow GxP regulations. So could you please provide more details? What particularities are there and what does it stand for?
Yeah, let's talk a bit about this magic abbreviation and like discuss what is it about. So what is GxP? GxP is a abbreviation for like a set of standards, and basically GxP stands for good anything practice, and anything is like a set of different practices, like for example good manufacturing practice or GMP, good clinical practice or GCP, and good laboratory practice or GLP for those who are working in laboratories. And yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting, but how does it relate to testing? Are there any testing specifics? Because this is the overall picture, pretty wide, but I'm more interested in testing.
Yes, sure. So the standard itself adds some kind of specific, not only to testing, but to development and work in general. So basically, in a GxP compliant process, you cannot perform testing like you can do like for other projects. Like, for example, you cannot perform only ad hoc testing. You cannot work without documentation. You cannot work like, for example, using only checklists, or you cannot create your test cases in Excel, like can be accepted on some projects. If we talk about GxP, then of course, as we deal with people's lives, then all of this should be verified, and it is strongly regulated, and you should provide a set of evidence that you've done exactly what your client was asking for, and that you've tested it correctly, and that in fact you've tested it. And so it means that you should have very detailed, well-written documentation. It has to deal not only with test cases and testing documentation, but also with requirements. And also, if we talk about GxP in general, three basic standards should be applied, which are traceability, accountability, and data integrity. It means like whatever you are doing, you have to understand like who contributed to this part, like who did exactly this part. This is like accountability, basically. Yeah, traceability, which tells you, allows you to track like who did the changes, why he did so, etc. And data integrity, it means that your data should be protected, and it appears on every level of testing. So meaning like test management systems should be compliant with the standards, your system where you keep requirements, etc., etc. So through all the levels of development.
That's interesting. Paulina, you know, on my latest projects, we applied agile methodology. This is, I would say, the most commonly used methodology nowadays. But with all these testing specifics that you have just mentioned, I think it would be hard to incorporate such SDLC into agile SDLC. So probably you can share some other particularities how to incorporate testing in life science.
Yes, sure. So, as like you probably know, some agile is not a good framework for approach for every project, and especially if the risks are high, then maybe some kind of more how to describe it, more stable process should be applied, and more reliable and process containing a lot of bureaucracy maybe should be in place. So if we talk about GxP, then basically GxP works with a V model. why it is called vModel. It is because it is breaking down into several stages, and stages are connected to like their other stages. So if we talk about vModel, then the whole process starts with project assessment and initiation, which during this stage you have to prepare a validation plan, which is like high-level plan that will tell you how you are going to validate your system. And during this stage, you also have to perform risk assessment, which Kate will tell in details later. So I'm omitting this part. And so after you've completed risk assessment and created validation plan, you have to start getting the requirements that you will be working on. So requirements have different levels, which like I'm sure you've met on other projects as well. So the first stage is getting user requirements. So during this stage, you collect requirements from user perspective. Like, for example, as a user, I want to have ability to do like something in laboratory, for example. After you get this requirement, you have to transform them to functional requirements, which are basically like transformation of these user requirements to technical language. And after this is completed and you understand like how the system should be built, you have all the requirements, like, I mean, from business perspective, your team should start working on technical documentation, like design specification, software architecture document, etc. So also technical part of how the system is built and developed should also be documented. And when all of this documentation is ready, you have to create the software and to validate it. So after the software is built, the next stage is installation qualification. So basically what installation qualification is, it is like the validation of the correctness of deployment and configuration of the system. So we can tell that installation qualification verifies design specifications. So at this stage, you validate the technical part. After installation qualification is completed, the next stage, which is called operational qualification, or OQ, is applied. And during this stage of verification, you check that all of your functional requirements are met. So we can say that this stage checks like functional specification. And after OQ is completed, you should move to performance qualification. And performance qualification, as you can see, like from vModel, verifies that the system works according to our user requirements, usually like it is done by some business users. And after this stage is completed, you can tell that your whole testing process is complete and whole development process complete, and you have to prepare the validation report that will prove that your validation has been performed according to the plan that you've created on the first stage. And all of this should be documented and tracked.
Okay, so does it mean that it's almost impossible to deliver in agile methodology for regulated software? And what to do if your client is focusing on agile and wants to use this exactly methodology? Are there any workarounds here?
Of course, it doesn't mean that it is impossible. So you should weight the risks, as Kate will tell you a bit later. But basically, of course, you can have GxP in Agile, not maybe for every project. For some, it is not applicable, but for others, yes. But basically, if you want to have GxP in Agile, what you have to do is to implement like the same vModel inside every iteration that you have. So you should incorporate the same process inside like shorter iteration, and I guess a lot of things that maybe you are doing manually, like on longer iterations, will be of course automated. So it will be like, of course, shift left.
So that's why you mentioned on the slide that the duration of such sprints would be about 4 weeks in general, longer than the duration of the general sprint, which might be up to 2 weeks, but not more than 2, right?
Depends on the particular project and depends on the particular process and requirements from the particular client, and also depends on the scope. You can adjust your scope to fit like the length of the iteration.
Okay, sounds interesting. Thank you. Thank you, Paulina. But now I would like to get more details about risk management, because I understand it's a very important topic for life science, and Paulina shared so many great examples why we need to follow risk management for life science, but probably Ekaterina will provide us more interesting facts on this topic.
Yeah, sure. So we all know what is risk, right? According to different standards, it is defined like the effect of uncertainty on objectives, or the combination of the probability of occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm, or it can be like uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has a positive or negative effect on one or more of the project objectives. And to increase the probability and impact of the opportunities and decrease the probability and impact of the threats is the purpose of risk management. So in the basic risk analysis, the probability and impact are used to calculate the overall money loss in case of feature or function failure in a product environment. And it is a big different in case of life science project, where the failure cost could be not only a money loss, but a company license, civil or criminal lawsuits against specific employee or the whole company, or the failure cost could be even human lives. So risk
It
management
sounds
is,
terrifying.
yeah. So risk management is quite essential, right, for life science
Mhm.
project. And yeah, this is a factor to be held in mind during the risk assessment. Yeah.
Probably you have some interesting examples to share with us.
Yeah, I could share a few examples of risk from life science projects. And the first example, this is risk from life science GxP project. This is project with clinical trials where data were blinded. Blinded, it means hiding or masking who is assigned to the treatment groups and who is assigned to the control groups in the experimental study. So that was a risk that third-party system could add some queries by mistake that could unblind the study. And there was no way to control what data is entered as unblinded. And in this case, the whole study, which lasted a couple of years, might fail or became compromised. So in overall, this risk was assessed and controlled, but yeah, that was such risk. And another example, this is risk from another company, and the risk was detected at the later stage. It was fortunate that it was caught early enough. Otherwise, the cost could be human lives. So it was a new exposure control system, which was generated for X-ray device. And the control function was assigned to software. During the latest stage of development, the risk analysis of the system revealed multiple failure modes that could lead to patient overexposure. And due to the problem being detected near the end of design phase, this case and very expensive and independent backup timer had to be incorporated to monitor this exposure time. So the problem was solved, and it was not affected to human lives, but it cost money. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for this very interesting examples. I have another more, practical question to you. So in my previous projects, I followed risk-based approach, and when you identify all the risks and you prioritize your functionality from business perspective to test the most important test cases first, and then not so prioritize cases, just to ensure that you got the fastest feedback on state of quality. So, and speaking about life science project and this approach, is it applicable here, or are there any particularities?
Yeah, you are talking about risk-based approach, right? Which is
Yes.
actually frequently used in life science projects as well. So this approach is a quality management approach that adapts activities based on the size of risk to minimize them. So this approach help very useful for life science project as well, because we can find a balance between quality management activities and risks, risk for patients, for users, and some regulatory risks. And what we can do with this approach, we can avoid unnecessary activities and some quality management bureaucracy. We can focus our resources on critical aspects more than on non-critical, and we can increase safety and legal conformity. So using this approach, we are ranking or prioritizing hazards to help determine which risk is the most serious and thus which to control first.
Okay, sounds pretty much similar to to the regular risk-based approach. Probably you can share with us how to assess all these risks, because here we would face particularities.
Yeah, I would say that there is no single way to determine the level of risk, nor with a single technique applied to all situation. So the organization must define which techniques will work best for each situation. And the main things is that approach and technique must be definitely confirmed with the customer. So the risk assessment can be like a discussion or brainstorming session based on the knowledge and experience, or like interviewing with stakeholders. So, and very useful would be to have these sessions with the customer. And yeah, I would like to share a few simple examples of life science GxP projects where risk-based approach was applied. So that was a project that had challenging things where were no business requirements, nor intended usage information, no potential users. At the same time, the full validation package has to be created that will meet all the compliance standards. So quite tricky situation. And here, risk-based approach helped. So what was done here? All functionality were divided into parts, and potential failure and possible negative outcome were defined for each functionality. Based on that, three criteria were defined, like impact or severity, then probability and detectability. And these criteria allowed to rank the functionality by assigning a priority to the risk. And as a result, all functionality was assessed by risk, and the functionality with high risk were covered by tests more, and less test coverage was applied for the functionality with low risks. In this case, risk-based approach as well as risk responsibility, of course, were discussed with customer.
Okay, and you mentioned below there is no silver bullet, so probably you can share any other techniques how to
Yeah,
identify and assess the
yeah,
risks.
let's switch to another slide. This is also life science GxP project where the system is used both for the data analysis with drug activities calculation and for the data storage. So all user stories and customer defects here were assessed in terms of GxP risk by data integrity criteria. And each factor, like audit trail, data archive, import-export data, and so on, was considered whether user story or defect might affect this factor or not. So if so, this user story has GxP risk. If no criteria affected, no GxP risk here. Then severity and probability were defined based on that assessment, and the risk priority was determined. And the last but not least example, the third example, yeah, that was a project where the purpose was to automate regression testing, but there was a plenty more than 2,000 of manual tests. So risk-based approach was used to identify manual tests to be automated for future regression runs. So what techniques are applied here? Overall risk in this approach is based on the calculation of risk points, where the integral risk is the summary of all risk weight multiplied by respective risk probability factor. So in the example, we can see what points are assigned to different risks for low, for medium, and for high. But the limit of the low, medium, and high risk could be flexible and depends on the number of risk or on the summary of risk weights and so on. So based on the risk level, here team defined what must be automated, what is nice to automate, and what could be once verified manually, for example. So quite useful techniques.
Thank you. Yeah, it is really useful, Ekaterina. And you touched a very important and very essential topic nowadays. I mean, test automation. And more and more test leaders and test managers don't want to reinvent the wheel, but prefer to take some open source solution. By the way, even at the PAM, we have plenty of accelerators and test automation frameworks available in open source. And take this existing solution and start test automation, I would say, from day one. What about GxP environment? Is it possible to follow this way for test automation?
Test automation can be sometimes a tricky part of a GxP process, but doesn't mean that it's impossible. Basically, maybe it's not as easy as for other projects. You cannot take any tool and use it. Basically, if you work in GxP, as we have already discussed today, your tool has to be GxP compliant as well. So it means that as a minimum, your tool should perform or execute traceability, accountability, and data integrity. So, but it's not enough. Sometimes your client can be more let's say, requesting, and you have to validate your test automation solution the same way you validate your software. So, for example, you should execute the same thing, like the same view model for your test automation solution. For example, I can tell you how I did this on my current project. I also had a client who was very unsure for a lot of reasons, a lot of risks about test automation. But basically what we did, we created the same validation plan. We discussed with him what kind of risks were worrying him. The biggest risk was, of course, that test automation results would not be relevant. So we might have false positive, false negatives. And when you deal with people's lives like we do, we assured them that we can build the process of validation of test automation results to make sure that they are correct. Also, they had a risk that as we're dealing with patients' data, there might be some vulnerabilities, and our test automation system is working with PHI data. So we implemented the same secure SDLC on our test automation framework and scripts as we do for the whole software. So we have a special security team who performs analysis of potential vulnerabilities. And also one more concern of our client was that as I said, you have to provide an evidence of testing. So you have to provide some kind of screenshots that you can show your auditors and assure them that the testing was performed, and that screenshot contains like the same actual result that was expected from the test case. And when you are doing the screenshots yourselves, you can like see what kind of data you're capturing. But when an automated testing tool is working, it can sometimes accidentally capture patients' data that should not be leaked. And we also implement the process of how to avoid capturing patients' data and capture only test data for this. So basically, yes, it's doable.
But anyway, how long did it take you to validate your framework and to pass all the stages?
First of all, our first step was to validate the IQOQ, so installation qualification, operational qualification. It took a long time. So this process of building a framework and creating test cases, the scripts for IQOQ, took about half a year. But the problem was that we are creating a product that should be deployed not only to our client, but our client also sells it to his clients. And in the end, we had a risk of having like too many deployments, and doing it manually was very difficult, and the team would be just growing and growing. So we were able to convince the client that yes, it's a good solution, and it was worth it in the end.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, girls. That sounds really, really amazing. So, no more questions from my side, but as far as I can see, we have plenty of questions from the audience. So, let me step in with the questions from our audience now. Where can we get the mock data for testing if the patient's data is protected?
Well, in fact, there are several approaches that can help you here. So first of all, you can get like a dummy data. If we talk about like different areas of life science, for some of them, there are already data that was prepared as a scope of some scientific work. For example, if we talk about genetics, like you can use, for example, genome in the bottle. So it means that a group of scientists work for creation of data that mocks the human's genome, and also for like chemical data. Kate maybe will tell you, but you also can find some relevant scientific information. You can also, like for example, if you cannot take your data, it's preferable to use it on the test data. But if you can do so, then following all the procedures of working with PHI data, you can take and obfuscate it and to test on the environment which is like protected, but your data is protected, and you don't have any like data that can tell you like who patients really are.
Okay, thank you. We have another very interesting question. Are there any specific testing methods for life science?
Speaking about specific testing methods, I would say there is regulatory requirements for sure, and it's just not a method itself. It's specific of the process. So your process should be built in order to be compliant with the requirements. If the question is, should you do something specifically for chemical or biological process, then it depends on the particular project.
Okay, thank you. We have a question related to risk management. How to define what low, medium, high impact or probability means, Ekaterina. This is probably the question to you.
I can take it. Yeah. So first of all, I would say that it needs to be discussed with the customer, whether they have required some required documents for risk assessment, and this definition might be already defined. So otherwise, if they don't have, so you can use some best practices, divide it with a team, or use definition from the previous experience. And the main thing is that that should be confirmed with the customer, of course, to be on the same page. As an example, the definition I can provide some small small definition example for severity or impact. So for the high, it can be mean that failure can directly leads to impact to patient safety, or loss of the company operations, or irreversible impact on GXP data integrity, something like that. For medium, the failure can indirectly leads to that, to impact, to product quality, feature, and so on. And for the low, failure in the activities has for example, reversible impact on GXP data integrity. So based on that simple definition, we can define our severity.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ekaterina. We have another very interesting question. I have also the same, actually. Is knowledge in the field of life science necessary? Some like understanding of chemical, biological processes or other stuff? And how often is this requirement encountered in real work? Do we need to be experts in domain knowledge?
Yeah, I can take this question too. So I would say that it depends on the projects and the project specific. So if the project with genomic objects, for example, with quite complicated dependency between objects, so in this case, yeah, this is mandatory to understand the basic principle of genomic engineering, for example, and to be aware of genomic objects used on the particular project, and about dependency between these projects. Or, for example, if the project with clinical trials, where it is mandatory to understand the clinical study life cycle and its phases. So having this knowledge might help to find the issue in the business logic of the system and to perform the requirements analysis more properly, I guess. So yeah, to sum up, for some projects, I would say often the project has a quite business complicated logic, and yeah, the basic understanding, basic knowledge is mandatory. Paulina, feel free to comment.
I would just only add that, yes, it mostly depends on the project. For some not complicated project, you don't have to be like, I don't know, a chemist or bioinformatics, like, I mean, a professional one with scientific degree, or maybe scientists, but for some projects who that are more complicated, some knowledge of chemistry or biology is required. But basically, if even if this knowledge is not required, it's always very beneficial for testers to understand the business domain and particular area they're working with, because they can better understand what they are doing. And yes, as Kate mentioned, it can help find some potential problems in the business logic.
Thank you, girls. We have another great question from the audience. It relates to trends. And are there any trends in life science, and what are the trends? And probably you can share your experience in applying AI/ML capabilities, if any, because everyone is talking about ChatGPT almost everywhere. So can we consider this technology in life science project as well? What is your vision on that?
Okay, so let me please start maybe with biological projects, as like I work mostly with bioinformatics, and Kate maybe will add her vision about chemical projects, as she is an expert in chemistry. So if we talk about like trends in life sciences in general, if we talk about healthcare and biology, a lot of projects will be using AI in the area of diagnosis. So, for example, there are already projects that help to set a diagnosis for a patient without like a real doctor or help doctor to do so. For example, they can analyze the symptoms. They can read the MRI scans or X-ray scans, etc., and find flaws better than a human being can, because they just reduce the human factor. And also the very big area is where we're currently working is predictive medicine, so-called. It's very promising, it's very growing, because this is the area that helps assess diagnosis in advance. So before the patient got sick, or at the very early stages, before the classical medicine can find diagnosis. It is based on genomics. So based on the genetic information of the person, you can definitely tell that he has some tendencies or risks of having a particular disease. Or like sometimes for oncology, you can say for sure that he has cancer without biopsy. So because the procedure is very traumatic and it's very painful, genetics helps you get the diagnosis without doing so. And if we speak also about the trends, I would say that during several, like I know, at least 10 years, also the life science was growing towards human longevity. As you know, like over the several last decades, or even like a century, human lives is getting longer and longer, and people just want to live longer and to live better. So also such application exists that can predict how you will be aging, how your
Wow,
body will be transforming.
that sounds amazing.
There are really such things. And if we speak about chemistry and pharma, this is also a very big trend in saving time in drug discovery. So I guess Kate will add a few words here, but basically a drug discovery is a very, very long process. It takes some 15, 20 years from the moment when you start working on the medicine before it goes to market. And AI helps you analyze the properties of your molecules and speed up drug discoveries to like 5-10 years. So Kate, please feel free to add something.
I agree that most projects are focused on the to decrease this time for the drug discovery, and if previously it was taken about 15 years, now the goal that it needs to be I don't know, decreased to 5 years or less. So yeah, and AI can be used for in drug discovery by predicting potential molecules to interact with drug targets and identify new drug targets. So yeah, it's quite useful, and I suppose this is good thing that it is applied in life science project too. But actually, I would like to add that not only AI, but AR and VR also applied in life science projects and gaming. So yeah, we are at the stage of a new interesting project, I suppose.
Yeah, and a great transformation is happening around us. Thank you so much, girls. It was very, very interesting conversation. Thanks for sharing so great information with me and, of course, with our audience. Thank you. Have a
Thank
good
you.
rest of the
Thank you
day.
for your
Thank you,
attention.
John.
Thank you for your question.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.